Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for that intro. That was lovely. So, I'm here today to talk with you about cultivating compassionate tech communities. So my company is called Compassionate Coding, which I will talk more on later. My Twitter handle is @AprilWensel. And remember, the hashtag for the event is #AnxietyTech. So share with people who couldn't be here with us today. So a little bit more on my background. I've spent the past 10 years kind of job hopping my way around the Bay Area as a software engineer and engineering leader. I worked at quite a variety of companies in the Bay Area. Here's a sampling. I've worked in health tech, education tech, gaming, research. That was great because it gave me a diversity of experience in a lot of different areas. And I think of myself as a proud job hopper because I think life's too short to stay in a place where you're unhappy. So I think, when you're unhappy, it's time to leave. So I did that. So one thing I noticed in all this experience is that tech culture can be kind of toxic. And I think, normally in my talks I have to make a case for this because people don't understand, but I think all of you here probably understand, which is part of why you're here. But I'll talk on it a little bit. So a couple years ago, I was at this meetup, and this woman who doesn't work in tech, but works in wellness, said, tech workers are not the happiest bunch. They're all overworked and under pressure, which I think is true. Stress and anxiety, huge problems in tech. Everyone's been talking about that. That's why we're here. I wrote this article about burnout. Burnout is a huge issue in tech, as we know. Wired came out with this article. Techies are using ketamine to fight their depression. And I think this wasn't just a sensational story. When working in tech, I've had friends who rely on alcohol and drugs to cope with the stress of the tech industry. We know about companies like Uber, but I think that they're not an isolated company. A lot of times these companies have aggressive workplace cultures. The Kapor Center did this study on why people leave tech, and they drew this conclusion: workplace culture drives turnover, significantly affecting the retention of underrepresented groups and costing the industry more than $16 billion each year. So this affects everybody, but it also has a particular effect on people from underrepresented groups. So tech culture, it's pretty toxic. So let's fix it. Okay, so to do that, we have to understand where culture comes from. It doesn't come from nowhere. So on one hand, our communities create our culture, right? Because the people in the community shape the culture. But who's in the community? What determines that? Well, the culture of the community kind of determines who wants to join that community. So it kind of goes in the other direction too. So really we have this interplay where we have our tech communities, we have our tech culture, and they affect each other in sometimes positive and sometimes negative ways. So what is even our tech community? It's a very vague term. We talk about people in tech, people working in tech. But what does that really mean? I mean, almost every company today is a tech company in the sense that they have a website. They probably have some programmers working on that website. In the work that I do with companies, I have an upcoming workshop at a hotel company that happens to have a tech arm, right? So there's different companies and whatnot. So our tech community really breaks down into different companies, different teams, open source projects, meetups, websites like Stack Overflow, more on that in a minute, Hacker News, Facebook, Twitter, mailing lists, college classes. Their tech community is really a bunch of smaller kind of sub-communities. And a lot of these communities, sadly, are characterized by things like a focus on the ego and proving that you're the best, and elitism, so proving that we're the smartest, and competition. So there's websites like HackerRank. Like, why do we need to rank each other in relation to each other, right? But this is what our tech communities are really based on: being a rock star, right? How many job descriptions still say looking for rock star devs, and we're a really smart team, and we want to hire smart people, right? Like, that's kind of the focus. So I'm going to talk about a specific example that's been on my mind for several years: Stack Overflow, because I think it's one of the most glaring examples of kind of really toxic tech culture. So I belong in this Facebook group for women in tech, and someone posted, "I've been really struggling this week. I've been in tears for most of it, and now I just got a snarky response on Stack Overflow telling me how easy the solution is and that I need to learn how to debug my own code. I'm ready to throw the towel in." This is really sad, right? It's this person who's just learning to code, and she asked for help on this website that's supposed to be, the most trusted community of software developers, right? So, you imagine, okay, well, that's the place to go if you have a problem. And, she gets a snarky response kind of, insulting her, right? It's pretty bad. So I saw this, And I saw it wasn't just this one-off kind of problem. This is a huge problem on Stack Overflow. It's like it affects so many people, and that's why when they come out with their survey, you see that there's so few women. I mean, I think it was like 92% male on their site recently. So I wrote this article, Suffering on Stack Overflow, which got a good bit of attention online, talking about how this community that they built was alienating to a lot of people. This book, Grit, by Angela Duckworth, she talks about the culture at Enron, and I see a lot of connections between the community in tech and the community that was built at Enron, and we all know what happened to Enron. So, demanding Enron employees prove that they were smarter than everyone else inadvertently contributed to a narcissistic culture. Employees were both incredibly smug and driven by deep insecurity to keep showing off. It was a culture that encouraged short-term performance but discouraged long-term learning and growth. And so I think a lot of times this is what happens in our tech community, because we're all trying to prove that we're the smartest, and so we're not motivated to help each other. We're not motivated to admit when we make mistakes. We're motivated to hide those mistakes and to intimidate other people. So Oren Shah wrote this great post on contempt culture, and I think that's what characterizes a lot of our communities. It's this idea that we insult other frameworks and other languages in tech to prove that ours is better, and it makes us feel better about ourselves. I've given into this myself. I wrote this post, Confessions of a Recovering Jerk Programmer, about myself, because I feel like in order to fit in this community in tech, I took on these traits of being insulting to other people and putting down other languages to make myself feel more important. So Karen Armstrong wrote this book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. I reference it often. And she writes, in a threatening environment, the human brain becomes permanently organized for aggression. And I think that many of the problems we see in tech are because of this, because we're afraid and we're insecure, and so we act based on those fears. And that's why I was a jerk. That's why a lot of people are jerks in tech, because there's this pressure. So this is pretty sad. This is really pretty heartbreaking. So I like to be inspiring, so we're going to switch it up a bit. So how do we improve our tech communities, right? Because communities can be these beautiful places that are supportive, these beautiful groups of people that help you. So how do we do it? So I think the answer is compassion. So what is compassion? A lot of people have misconceptions, I feel like, about compassion. So compassion is not being fake nice. That's not compassionate. Compassion is not being polite. It's not just following a set of rules. That's not what compassion is. And compassion's not pity. Pity is feeling sorry for someone and not really respecting them. That's not what compassion is either. Compassion is the feeling that arises when you are confronted with another's suffering and feel motivated to relieve that suffering. This definition comes from the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley, a great resource. So compassion, a lot of people come to compassion through their religion. I, however, came to compassion through my stomach. So a couple years ago, I went vegan, and I attended a conference about being vegan, and I learned a lot about compassion, because veganism is really about having compassion for all living beings. This is a picture of what I had for dinner last night, which is close by, so you all should check it out if you're local, or you're all local today, so check it out. Peña Pachamama. This is the margarita pizza, all vegan, all good, all compassionate. So this is why I started my company, Compassionate Coding, 2 years ago, because I thought that the same compassion for all living beings, that's what was missing in tech. We have all this suffering going on in tech, and nobody cares, because we're so focused on our machines that we're not really thinking about each other and helping each other. So what I do with my company is I teach emotional intelligence to software engineers and people working in tech so that teams can work together better. So compassionate coding really is a new approach to software development that seeks to minimize suffering for everybody involved in the process. So that means software developers, product managers, everybody in the business, your customers, and then the community at large, which is the bigger picture here, is that when we can improve our tech communities, we can also improve the products that we build. So I do believe that we can achieve really happy, healthy communities of people that are collaborative and supportive and joyful, not suffering all the time, not so anxious all the time, not so stressed and burning out all the time. And this really affects the bottom line as well. It's not just nice to have, which is why hopefully your company's paid for you to be here, because everything that you're going to learn here is going to help you in your day-to-day life to be a more productive employee as well. Sean Murphy wrote in The Optimistic Workplace that people in positive work environments outperform those who work in negative climates by 10 to 30%. In a positive work environment, people are more confident about their work and they enjoy working with one another. So 10 to 30% is a great improvement, right? Like, I mean, who doesn't want that? And you can do that by making your environments more positive, making your work community more positive. So what is a compassionate tech community? Well, a compassionate community in general, the needs in one of those, the needs of all members of that community are recognized and met, the well-being of the entire community is a priority, and all people and living things are treated with respect. So for tech, I think a compassionate tech community helps us learn and grow, offers support and encouragement, and provides a sense of belonging. So I mentioned before that our communities are currently focusing on things like ego, elitism, competition, being smart, being a rock star. I think we can switch those up and instead create communities that focus on humility, inclusion, cooperation, being kind, being a mentor. Transitioning from one to the other is how you go from being kind of this hostile, aggressive community into a more compassionate, more supportive community. You, each one of you, is part of many communities. You're part of the community of this conference. You're part of a community of people who care about mental health. You're a part of the community of tech in general that we spoke of earlier, and many others, the meetups you attend, the websites that you frequent, the languages that you use, and then maybe mailing lists you're on, open source projects, all of these communities you're part of. And so you can create change in these communities. You don't have to be a community leader. You can just be a contributor in these communities. You really can make a difference in these communities for the better. So that's why I want to share with you 3 steps for cultivating a compassionate community, no matter what role you're playing in that community, whether you're an organizer or just a participant. Now, before I get into that, I will say that a lot of times developers aren't so happy about creating compassionate communities. This article came out recently about a Linux open source project. Programmers are having a huge debate over whether they should be required to behave respectfully to each other. This headline is just hilarious to me, and also just so, and with the picture too, it's just so indicative of like tech culture right here. So because of that, I don't use a lot of the same terms that are used when people talk about communities, mostly because I like this quote by Marshall Rosenberg from Nonviolent Communication. I believe it is in everyone's interest that people change not in order to avoid punishment, but because they see the change as benefiting themselves. So I don't think our tech communities are going to change because we create stringent rules and punish people. There may be a role for that, but I don't think that that's how real big change is going to happen. I think you have to inspire people to change because of how it will benefit them. And compassion will benefit everyone. When you're compassionate towards others, you experience more joy, resilience, peace of mind, job satisfaction, and a lower chance of burnout. There's more on this from the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley that I mentioned earlier. That's the link there. Okay, so the steps are, 1 is just to observe. Now, to observe what's going on in your community, you must slow down. And I know this is hard for us working in tech because everything's moving very quickly. But you really do need to slow down if you're going to be really understanding what people are going through, because we move too quickly for, during our normal day-to-day life in tech to really appreciate the human side of what's going on, so you must slow down. Remember that you're dealing with human beings, not machines, okay? So you can't expect people to, behave consistently all the time because they're not machines. They have emotions going on all the time. We all do. And then ask yourself, what is valued in this community? What behaviors are rewarded? Who is in this community? Are there groups of people missing from this community? How are newcomers treated? How is power distributed in this community? So that might mean, who gets to make decisions? Who gets to decide, what happens? Like, for example, on Stack Overflow, people have, reputation points, right, that they get from answering questions. And so they have more power in the community and even to shape what rules are, permitted in that community. So it's good to know how power works in your community. And that intersects with, of course, power dynamics in society at large. That's also worth considering. So, the real question here is who is suffering in the community? Because compassion is about noticing and alleviating suffering. So who's suffering in your community, And you can figure this out by looking around, building that empathy, looking for signs of people, like was somebody in your team normally really productive, and then all of a sudden they kind of stop being productive? You may immediately think, oh, they're just lazy, or oh, we should just fire them. But instead maybe pause and think, I wonder if something's going on in their life that's causing them to, lose productivity. Maybe there was the death of a loved one, something like that. So ask yourself that question, who's suffering? And then how do we reduce the suffering? So what can you do to help people in your community, whatever community that may be? How can you reduce that suffering? So you observe, you kind of gather all this information. That's step one. Step two is to act, okay? So when you act, it's good to keep in mind the growth mindset. So this idea that, you're not gonna fix everything overnight, but once you've observed the current state of your community, you figure out, okay, how do we get better, right? And so you come in with a growth mindset, focus on continuous improvement. Don't feel like you have to do it all overnight, because that's not how change happens. So at the first level, what you can do in your communities is model compassion. So that could look like answering questions kindly on Stack Overflow. So when I tweet and write a lot about Stack Overflow, and people are like, well, I do my part, I answer questions really kindly on Stack Overflow, and that's great, and that's a great way that you can model compassion for others. You know how when you're writing code, a lot of times when somebody new joins the team, they'll model kind of the style that's all around the code where they're adding it? It's similar in communities, where if there's communication that's really hostile, then other people joining the community are gonna, likewise exhibit hostile behavior. So if you model compassion, you can inspire others. So you'll want to avoid phrases like, you're doing it wrong. I mean, how many times have you heard that in tech? You're doing it wrong. That's a terrible idea. If you see people tweeting that all the time about various things, that's a terrible idea. Why don't you just blah, 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 blah? That's condescending. RTFM, I wrote a whole article about how we should retire RTFM. Recommend reading it, because I think that's just, it's a terrible part of our culture. Oh, I just said terrible idea, but you know what I mean. We'll let it go. Moving on. No one's perfect. We'll talk about that later. So the next step is to assume positive intent. So, it's easy to assume that people are kind of out to get you, and that, if they break the build, they probably did it just to annoy you, or if they ignored your pull request or ignored your email, it's just because they don't like you, and none of this is really helpful to communication. So I would say assume positive intent. And you're like, well, sometimes there is negative intent, and there is, right? But if you assume negative intent, then you're starting from this hostile place, and you're going to respond with hostility. So assume people are coming from a good place, because most of the time they are, really, most of the time they are. So you practice nonviolent communication. I'm not going to go through all of the steps of this, because there's a whole book on it. I recommend the book, but that's one way that you can exhibit compassion in your communities. Eliminate blame and eliminate shame. These are two things that seem to be pretty heavy in tech. We love talking about who's to blame, when somebody does break the build. I remember hearing stories when I first got started in tech about how some companies would make people wear a dunce cap when they broke the build, and some companies have a red light on your desk that will shine when you break the build. There's no need to be calling people out. We're all in this together, right? So there's no need for blame, there's no need for shame. Another thing you can do is amplify voices, especially from people from underrepresented groups, because a lot of times the reason people in underrepresented groups are suffering in these tech communities is because they're not being heard, they're not being noticed, people aren't listening to them. So if you can amplify voices of people in your community, you can alleviate suffering. Also, reach out to anyone who seems like they're struggling and see if there's anything you can do to help. Sometimes just listening to them with empathy is enough. So the first step is just to model compassion, right? The next step is to encourage compassion. It's kind of the next level up. So for example, you might share your concerns when you see hostile behavior. So when you see other people not being compassionate, you say something about it. And you don't call them out, because again, that's not compassionate. So I see people talking about compassion or empathy, but then what they write about it is not itself very compassionate, right? So it's if you're gonna address somebody about not being compassionate, then it doesn't help if you come in using swear words and yelling at them and shouting at them, because then you're kind of fighting fire with fire, and everything's gonna burn down. So wouldn't do that. You can ask your community to clarify values. So just get everyone on the same page. If it doesn't seem like people are valuing compassion, why not? Maybe you should bring it up in your community in these discussions. Another thing you can do is improve the onboarding of newcomers. So a lot of times these communities aren't very compassionate because new people don't know how to join, or they feel intimidated. So perhaps you can update documentation, or create practices, processes, put processes in place to help new people, provide a way for them to ask questions, things like that. Okay, so you observe, you act. Step 3 is to reflect. Very important step. So I like to use this tool of a retrospective. I get this from Agile software development. When I first learned about it, I kind of hated it, because you have to talk about what you did wrong, and I was kind of a perfectionist, and I hated it. But I eventually learned to love it, because again, it's not about blame. It's about looking for what went well, what you can do better, and then how do you get better? So what action steps can you take? So I think when you're trying to improve your communities, I would take the same kind of step, where you reflect and you think, what's going well in the community, especially after I've made these changes? What could go better, and what am I going to do next time to make that better? And so, practice self-compassion during this process. So if things are slow going, because I'll tell you, this is tough work. When you're trying to reshape communities, it's tough. You're going to get a lot of resistance because the status quo, the reason it's the status quo is there's a lot of momentum there behind it. So it's really hard to change things. So practice self-compassion, meaning if you run into roadblocks, don't beat yourself up. Be kind to yourself, because it's hard to be compassionate towards others if you can't be compassionate towards yourself. Shamik is going to talk more on self-care later, and I encourage you to attend that talk too, because I think it'll be really helpful in this department. So Karen Armstrong, who I mentioned earlier, writes, "Sometimes you will remember that you've behaved unkindly and inconsiderately. At this point, have compassion for yourself. Smile wryly at your omission and resolve to do better tomorrow." Like me when I said terrible earlier, right? I'll do better next time. So avoid compassion fatigue. So like I said, like this work is challenging. When I speak out about problems in the community, especially like Stack Overflow or anywhere else, it's hard. It's hard because I see so many people suffering, so that's one aspect, and then it's hard because of all the pushback, right? So it's like, it's easy to get exhausted when you're trying to do this work of bringing more compassion. And so, we're talking about mental health today, right? So you also have to, take care of yourself in that way. So don't let yourself get exhausted by the work, and again, self-care comes into play there. And another thing to ask yourself is if you get to a certain point, are you sure you still want to be part of this community, right? So I choose not to participate in Stack Overflow, for example, because I think it's too far gone, to be honest. They might be able to change it, but right now, it's toxic to my mental health, so I don't participate. So think about the communities you're in. If you're trying to change them and you can't, maybe it's time to get out. Like I mentioned, I job hop, because when companies would become toxic to me, I would leave, because life, again, is too short to stay. And I would try to change, like I would stay at those companies, try to change the culture. But at a certain point, there's only so much you can do, especially when you're an individual contributor. But even if you're in leadership, like depending on the size of the company and who else is, the makeup, it can be hard to change. So out of self-care, sometimes the best option is to leave. So the 3 steps, just to sum it up, you observe, you act, you reflect, pretty standard, pretty straightforward here. But the power is in that slowing down and doing them consistently. And this really has a ripple effect, because it's not just about shaping, our tech communities and our companies and our meetup groups and events and open source projects. It's not just that. It's also the products that we build. Because if we're more compassionate to each other as we're building these products, we're going to end up building more compassionate products. That means products that are actually helping people, that are alleviating suffering in the world. So it has this great ripple effect. So I talked about the tech community and what goes into that, but I really would invite you to think of the global community, because that's the other thing we're part of. We're all part of, we're all on Earth, right? If nothing else, we have that commonality. And so I would say focus on that, focus on what we have in common. So I now live in San Diego, in Encinitas, and there's this beautiful meditation garden near me. And they have these little booklets with inspirational words, and one of them had this: "When people speak of political, social, or international problems, they often do not realize that these conditions are nothing more than the accumulated thoughts and actions of millions of individuals. And the only way to change world conditions is to change ourselves." So I think sometimes we look around our world, we see a lot of problems, and we think, it's too much, I'm just one person, what can I do? Well, I think we can reshape that quote in this way. A community is nothing more than the accumulated thoughts and actions of individuals. And the only way to change our communities is to change ourselves. And so that's what I invite you to do. I invite you to plant these seeds of compassion, know that it's going to be difficult sometimes, and that people are going to flame you online, but keep doing it anyway, because that's the only way things are ever going to change. So here's my information. My website is compassionatecoding.com. I'm going to have a burnout prevention course coming out soon, which would be pretty exciting to help people avoid burnout. And here's some book recommendations. Feel free to email me as well, because I love to hear from people, april@compassionatecoding.com. And since it's almost lunchtime, I'm sure that if you see me, feel free to reach out with questions or comments or criticisms, whatever. I can handle it. So thank you so much.